The mountain groaned like a dying beast moments before the world turned white. Clara Whitmore pressed her back against the cabin's log wall, needle suspended mid-stitch as the first rumble shook dust from the rafters. Through the frosted window, snow cascaded down Devil's Ridge in a thunderous wall, swallowing pine trees whole. Her sewing basket tumbled to the floor, spools of thread rolling like marbles as the cabin shuddered. Get down! The Ute guide on her kitchen table tried to rise despite the makeshift splint binding his broken leg. Blood seeped through the torn fabric of his buckskin leggings where Clara had cleaned the wound with her precious carbolic acid. She dove beneath the heavy oak table as her world exploded. The avalanche struck with the force of a locomotive, timber screaming as the cabin's north wall buckled inward. Glass shattered, mixing with the roar of 10,000 tons of snow claiming the mountainside. Clara curled around her sewing basket, protecting the tools that meant survival. Needles sharp as surgeons' instruments, thread strong enough to bind wounds, thimbles that could serve as tiny scoops. When silence finally returned, they were buried alive. Are you? Clara's voice caught on the familiar stumble. She forced the words through her tight throat. Are you hurt worse? Joseph Tallbear shifted in the suffocating darkness. No worse than before you pulled a tree branch from my leg, silent woman. His English carried the careful cadence of someone who'd learned it trading with whites. But we cannot stay here. Snow will freeze us or crush this table. Clara's fingers found her late husband's leather journal in her apron pocket. Thomas had written everything in those pages. Trading routes, survival techniques learned from mountain men, detailed notes about Ute winter practices. She had memorized every word during the long months since his death, when the townspeople of Silver Creek had made it clear a stammering widow had no place among them. The rejected mail-order bride correspondence still stung. Cannot accept a wife who cannot speak properly to customers or children. A man needs a helpmate who can represent his household with dignity. There's a way, Clara whispered, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. My husband wrote about snow caves, the Ute method. Joseph's silence stretched long enough that Clara wondered if he'd lost consciousness. Then, your husband traded with my people? Thomas Whitmore. He said the Ute taught him to read snow like white men read books. Clara crawled toward the muffled sound of his breathing. Her hands found his shoulders, solid and warm beneath the deerskin shirt. He wrote that packed snow becomes a shelter, not a grave. Thomas. Joseph's voice carried recognition. He was honest trader. Gave fair prices for beaver pelts, never brought whiskey to corrupt young men. Clara's throat tightened with grief and something else, pride that this man had known Thomas as honorable. He's dead 6 months now. Rockslide while checking his mining claim. I am sorry, silent woman. She almost corrected him. Her name was Clara, but the title felt oddly comfortable. In Silver Creek, her stammer made her invisible. Here, buried alive with a stranger, her silence seemed to have value. Working by touch, Clara began excavating. Her thimbles became tiny shovels, scooping packed snow away from what remained of the shattered window. Joseph helped, despite his injured leg, his larger hands efficient where hers were precise. The work warmed them, blood flowing back into numbed fingers. Snow must be right consistency, Joseph said, testing a handful. Like wet sand for children's castles. Clara nodded, remembering Thomas's journal entries. Warm enough to pack, cold enough to hold. We need to make the cave small. Body heat will keep us alive. They worked in careful rhythm, Clara's seamstress precision guiding the excavation while Joseph's knowledge of snow behavior prevented collapse. When her needle case spilled, she didn't mourn the scattered steel. Each needle could become an ice pick. Thread could bind splints or snare small game. Hours passed. Clara's wool dress grew heavy with melted snow, but Thomas's journal had prepared her for this too. She pulled off her outer skirt and wrung it out, then wrapped the damp wool around heated stones from the cabin's collapsed fireplace, improvised warming bottles that would keep them alive through the night. You know much for white women, Joseph observed as Clara arranged their makeshift shelter. She wanted to explain that she knew nothing, that everything came from a dead man's careful notes, but the words tangled in her throat as they always did with strangers. Instead, she showed him Thomas's journal, pointing to sketches of snow cave construction beside detailed Ute vocabulary. Joseph studied the pages by the dim light filtering through their snow window. Your husband drew my grandfather's teachings. This man, he listened with respect. Clara felt warmth that had nothing to do with the heated stones. Thomas had been respected here in ways the people of Silver Creek never acknowledged. Her stammering husband, who'd struggled with words as much as she did, had been seen as worthy by this man's people. Outside their tiny cave, wind howled across the mountainside. Clara pressed close to Joseph's warmth, professional necessity overriding social propriety. His breath came steady and strong, unlike the labored gasping she'd heard from men dying of mountain fever or mining accidents. The avalanche, she said carefully, fighting her stutter. It wasn't natural. Joseph's body tensed. How do you know? Clara had noticed what others might miss, the too regular spacing of the snow breaks, the pattern that spoke of controlled blasting rather than natural shifts. Her seamstress eye, trained to spot flawed stitching and irregular patterns, had caught what mountain men might overlook. The breaks were too even, like someone set charges to bring down the whole slope at once. She hesitated, then added, My husband's claim is down there. Was down there. In the darkness, Joseph's breathing changed. There are white men who would kill for mining claims, men who do not honor law or treaties. Clara thought of Marcus Brennan, Silver Creek's self-appointed leader, who'd been pressuring her to sell Thomas's claim for a fraction of its worth. Who'd suggested marriage to his foreman as a solution to her property problems. Who'd made it clear that stammering widows had no rights worth respecting. We need to reach Silver Creek, she said, but not to surrender. Joseph's hand found hers in the darkness, calloused from leatherwork, warm despite the cold. Then we survive this night, silent woman, and tomorrow we begin to fight. Clara squeezed his fingers, surprised by her own certainty. For the first time since Thomas's death, she had purpose beyond mere survival. She had someone who saw her strength instead of her stumbling words. Outside, the mountains settled into winter silence. Inside their snow cave, two unlikely allies planned their descent into a world that underestimated them both. Dawn came gray and bitter, filtering through the snow wall Clara had built during the night's coldest hours. She woke to find Joseph's fever had broken, his breathing no longer shallow with pain. The makeshift splint she'd fashioned from chair legs and her best silk ribbon had held through the night. Your stitching is strong as sinew, he said, examining where she'd closed the deepest cut on his leg with embroidery thread. My grandmother would approve such work. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. Men in Silver Creek rarely noticed her needlework except to criticize the cost of thread or complain about buttons sewn too loose. It's just what I know. They broke through their snow cave into air so sharp it cut the lungs. The avalanche had scoured the mountainside clean, leaving a wasteland of broken trees and scattered boulders. Where Clara's cabin had stood, only the stone chimney remained, jutting from the snow like a gravestone. 3 days to Silver Creek on good trails, Joseph said, testing his weight on the injured leg. 5 days now with snow this deep and my leg healing. Clara studied their situation with the same methodical approach she used for complex alterations. Her sewing basket had survived the avalanche, leather construction meant to withstand years of use. Inside, 12 needles of varying sizes, 4 spools of heavy thread, 2 thimbles, small scissors, and a paper of pins. Her reticule contained $3 silver, Thomas's journal, and the legal papers for his mining claim. We'll need to travel light, she said, then stopped. Travel where exactly? Silver Creek offered no sanctuary for a stammering widow, especially one accompanied by an injured Ute guide. As if reading her thoughts, Joseph said, There is Ute winter camp in valley below Silver Creek. My people would shelter us both. Both? Clara's voice caught. They'd accept me? You saved my life. That creates obligation, but also family bond. Joseph's expression grew serious. But white men in Silver Creek will not like seeing you with my people. Clara thought of Marcus Brennan's cold eyes, his foreman's grabbing hands during the marriage interview she'd endured. They don't like me much anyway. They began their descent as the sun reached its weak zenith. Clara had fashioned crude snowshoes from chair slats and strips torn from her petticoats, an idea from Thomas's journal, adapted with a seamstress's understanding of tension and binding. Joseph moved carefully but steadily, using a walking stick Clara had shaped with her small scissors. The first day taught them each other's capabilities. Joseph could read weather signs Clara couldn't see, predicting wind shifts that would have caught her in the open. Clara's sewing supplies solved problems Joseph hadn't expected. Thread became fishing line when they found an ice-free stream. Needles served as crude fish hooks. Her thimbles worked as small scoops for gathering pine nuts. "Your husband wrote much truth about Ute ways," Joseph said as they made camp beneath a rock overhang. "But some things cannot be learned from books." He showed her how to build a fire that wouldn't smoke, using dry inner bark and arranging kindling like the spokes of a wheel. Clara watched intently, memorizing each step. In return, she demonstrated how to waterproof their makeshift shelter using pine pitch heated over the fire, then applied with strips of fabric. "White women in town fear such work," Joseph observed as Clara sealed gaps in their windbreak. "They think soft hands show high standing." Clara examined her hands, calloused from needlework, stained with pine sap, but steady and capable. "Soft hands don't keep you alive in the mountains." That evening, as they shared the last of Clara's cornbread and Joseph's dried venison, she found herself speaking more freely than she had since Thomas's death. The stammer that plagued her in Silver Creek seemed less urgent here, where survival mattered more than social graces. "Thomas always said I was too quiet for town life," she confided. "The mail order agencies all rejected my applications, said no man wanted a wife who couldn't speak properly." Joseph fed small sticks to their fire, considering. "Among my people, those who speak little are thought to hear much. Wisdom often lives in silence." Clara felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. "The townspeople think I'm simple. Brennan told the preacher I wasn't fit to teach children because of my stammer." "This Brennan," Joseph said carefully, "he wants to buy your husband's claim? He wants to steal it. Says a woman can't work a mine, can't defend her property." Clara's voice grew stronger with anger. "He offered me $20 for land Thomas said was worth hundreds." Joseph's expression darkened. "There have been other widows. Ute women have seen their men buried after accidents near the mines, always when they found good ore." Clara pulled Thomas's journal from her reticule, opening to pages covered with his careful sketches of the mining claim. Thomas marked every vein of ore, every boundary stone. He said someone would try to steal the claim after he died. By firelight, Joseph studied Thomas's detailed maps. His finger traced property lines, ore deposits, water sources. "Your husband was thorough man. These drawings show more than mining company knows." "What do you mean?" "Brennan's men work claim that touches yours on north boundary, but your husband's map shows they dig on your land, not theirs." Joseph looked up from the journal. "This is proof of theft." Clara felt her heart race. But who would believe me, a stammering widow and an Indian guide against the most powerful man in Silver Creek? Joseph was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Then, "My grandfather once told me that truth is like good steel. It may bend under pressure, but it will not break." "Pretty words don't stop bullets or legal papers." "No," Joseph agreed. "But your husband left you more than pretty words. He left you knowledge and tools and proof of what is yours by right." Clara looked at her sewing basket, her fingers touching the smooth leather. Inside were instruments precise enough for surgery, thread strong enough to bind wounds, needles sharp enough to pierce the toughest hide, tools that had already saved Joseph's life and her own. "We'll need allies in Silver Creek," she said slowly. "My people trade there, not welcome in town, but necessary for supplies." Joseph's expression grew thoughtful. "There are others Brennan has cheated. White settlers who lost claims to legal complications." Clara nodded, understanding dawning. "The preacher's wife mentioned families who'd left suddenly, said they couldn't prove their ownership when challenged. Same pattern as with Ute families. Same forged papers, same accidents." The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the rock walls. Clara realized she was no longer thinking like a victim seeking shelter, but like a woman planning a campaign. The sensation was both terrifying and exhilarating. "Tomorrow we reach the valley," Joseph said. "My people will give us food, warm shelter, time to plan." And then? Joseph's smile was sharp as winter wind. "Then we return to Silver Creek, not as refugees, but as hunters." Clara pulled her wool shawl closer, but the cold she felt now had nothing to do with mountain weather. Tomorrow would bring her face to face with Marcus Brennan and the town that had rejected her. But this time, she wouldn't be asking for acceptance. This time, she would be demanding justice. The Ute winter camp nestled in a protected valley like a cluster of brown seeds scattered across white snow. Clara counted 15 lodges arranged in a careful circle, smoke rising straight up in the still air. Dogs barked at their approach, and children peered from doorways before ducking back inside. "They're afraid of me," Clara said, noting how the camp's activity ceased as she and Joseph made their careful way down the slope. "They are careful," Joseph corrected. "White women who come to Ute camps usually bring soldiers behind them." An elderly woman emerged from the largest lodge, her silver hair braided with ribbons and small bones. She spoke rapidly in Ute, her tone sharp with concern as she examined Joseph's splinted leg. "My grandmother, Singing Crane," Joseph said. "She asks why I travel with white women and whether you bring trouble to our people." Clara straightened her shoulders. The respectful thing would be to wait silently while the men decided her fate. But Thomas's journal had taught her that Utah women held authority in domestic matters, and survival was certainly domestic. "Tell her I've seen her grandson's courage and skill," Clara said clearly, her stammer barely noticeable. "Tell her I offer my needle skills to help her people in gratitude for shelter." Joseph translated, his voice carrying surprise at her directness. Singing Crane's weathered face showed no expression as she studied Clara's sewing basket, then the careful binding on Joseph's leg. She spoke again, pointing at Clara's hands. "She wants to see your work," Joseph said. Clara opened her basket and withdrew a half-finished shirt she'd been mending when the avalanche struck. Fine cotton with intricate embroidery around the collar. Singing Crane examined the stitching with the eye of an expert, running her fingers along seams that would hold under hard use. After a long moment, the old woman nodded. She spoke to Joseph, then gestured for Clara to follow her. "You are welcome in our camp," Joseph translated. "Grandmother says good sewing is proof of patient heart." The lodge Singing Crane shared with two other women was warm and comfortable. Thick buffalo hides layered over the ground, and practical baskets arranged around the walls. Clara was given a place near the fire and a bowl of stew rich with venison and wild onions. For the first time in months, she felt truly welcome somewhere. Over the next 2 days, Clara found herself drawn into the camp's daily rhythms. Her needles could repair torn winter clothing that would otherwise be useless until spring. Her thread, stronger than sinew, could mend snowshoes and secure loose bindings on essential tools. In return, the women taught her to scrape hides properly, to identify edible winter plants, to read weather signs and cloud patterns. "Among your people, women who cannot speak easily are thought weak," Singing Crane said through Joseph's translation. "Among Ute, such women are thought to be good listeners. Good listeners make wise counselors." Clara felt tears sting her eyes. She'd never thought of her stammer as anything but a shameful weakness. Here it seemed to mark her as someone worth teaching. On the third morning, Joseph announced his leg was strong enough for the final day's journey to Silver Creek. Clara felt her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. The warmth of the Ute camp had reminded her how cruel the outside world could be to those who didn't fit its narrow expectations. "I don't have to go back," she said quietly. "I could stay here, help with sewing and mending." Joseph's expression grew serious. "You could. My people would welcome such help. But Marcus Brennan would still have your husband's claim, still be stealing from others who cannot fight him." Clara touched Thomas's journal through her apron pocket. What if no one believes us? What if they side with Brennan because he's powerful and we're just outsiders? "Then we will have tried," Joseph said simply, "and your husband's truth will not die with you." They left the camp with gifts, warm moccasins to replace Clara's worn boots, dried meat for the journey, and something more valuable. The promise that the Ute would trade regularly in Silver Creek, making their presence normal rather than threatening. If Clara needed allies, she would have them. The approach to Silver Creek filled Clara with dread. The town perched on a hillside like a collection of wooden boxes, smoke from chimneys the only sign of life in the bitter afternoon. The main street was rutted frozen mud between false-fronted buildings that promised more prosperity than they delivered. There, Clara pointed to a small house near the end of town. That was Thomas's place, where I've been living. But as they drew closer, Clara saw smoke rising from the chimney and horses tied at the hitching post. Through the window she glimpsed movement. Someone had taken possession of her home. "Brennan works quickly," Joseph observed. Clara's heart hammered as they approached the front door. Before she could knock, it opened to reveal Jake Morrison, Brennan's foreman. His pale eyes looked Clara up and down with undisguised hunger, then fixed on Joseph with obvious hostility. "Well, well, the widow Whitmore returns." Morrison's smile showed too many teeth. "And with a red savage for company. That explains a lot." "This is my house," Clara said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "You have no right to be here." Morrison stepped onto the porch, hand resting on his gun belt. "Actually, I do. Mr. Brennan holds the deed now, legal and proper, filed with the territorial government. Seems your husband owed considerable debts." Clara felt the world tilt. "That's impossible. Thomas paid his debts." "Paper says different." Morrison pulled a folded document from his coat. "Gambling debts to Brennan's saloon, unpaid supply bills, interest compounded monthly. Comes to more than the property's worth." Clara didn't need to examine the paper to know it was false. Thomas had never gambled, never drank, never bought supplies on credit. But the document looked official, complete with territorial seal and legal language. "You're lying," she said. Morrison's expression hardened. "Careful, widow. Calling respectable men liars can be dangerous, especially for women who keep unsavory company." His meaning was clear. Clara felt Joseph tense beside her, sensed the violence coiled in both men. If this escalated to bloodshed, Joseph would be blamed regardless of who started the fight. "I want to speak with Mr. Brennan," Clara said. "He's busy, but he did leave a message for you." Morrison's smile returned. "His offer still stands. Marriage to me and all these complications go away. You get a husband, I get a proper house, and everyone's happy." Clara looked at her home, the kitchen window where she'd sewn by morning light, the garden plot where she'd planned to grow vegetables, the bedroom where she'd grieved Thomas and tried to build a solitary life. All of it stolen with forged papers and legal theft. "And if I refuse?" Morrison shrugged. "Then you're trespassing on private property. Sheriff might have to arrest you and your Indian friend for disturbing the peace." Clara felt something cold and sharp crystallize in her chest. The familiar fear was still there, the stuttering anxiety that made her want to hide from confrontation. But beneath it was something new, rage as pure and clean as mountain snow. "I see," she said quietly. "Well then, I suppose I'd better gather my things." Morrison looked surprised by her quick surrender. "Smart woman. Pack light, you'll be moving into my cabin tonight if you're sensible." Clara stepped past him into her own kitchen, Joseph following close behind. Her sewing machine sat in the corner where she'd left it, her good scissors still in their leather case on the table. Morrison had taken possession of her house, but he hadn't bothered with the seamstress's tools. "5 minutes," Morrison called. "Then we discuss terms." Clara nodded meekly, then quickly gathered what mattered. Thomas's journal, her sewing supplies, and a small tin box hidden behind the flour barrel. Inside the box were her marriage certificate, the original deed to Thomas's property, and 23 silver dollars she'd earned mending clothes for traveling merchants. "Do you submit to this theft?" Joseph asked quietly in Ute, a language Morrison couldn't understand. "I retreat to fight another day," Clara replied in the same tongue, words Joseph had taught her during their journey. Morrison's eyebrows rose. "Didn't know you spoke savage, widow." "I'm learning many new things," Clara said. "More than you might expect." They left the house with Clara's few possessions bundled in a spare quilt. Morrison watched from the porch, gun still prominently displayed, as they walked toward the center of town. "Where will you go?" he called. "No respectable family will take in a woman traveling with an Indian." Clara didn't answer, but she felt Joseph's questioning glance. Where indeed? The boarding house wouldn't accept them, the hotel would refuse service, and camping outside town in winter meant slow death from cold. Then Clara remembered something Thomas had written about Silver Creek's early days, about the people who'd built the town before men like Brennan arrived to steal it from them. "The church?" she said quietly. "Reverend Phillips can't refuse shelter to someone seeking sanctuary." Joseph nodded, understanding. "And churches keep records. Baptisms, marriages, deaths, proof of who lived here first." Clara felt the first spark of hope since seeing Morrison in her kitchen. Thomas helped build that church. His name is carved on the cornerstone. As they walked toward the small wooden building at the town's heart, Clara noticed curtains twitching in windows, faces peering out to watch the scandalous sight of a white woman walking companionably beside an Indian man. Let them stare. Let them whisper. She was no longer the stammering widow who begged for acceptance. She was Thomas Whitmore's wife, and she had come home to reclaim what was rightfully hers. The church door stood unlocked, as it always did. Inside, afternoon light slanted through plain glass windows onto wooden pews Thomas had helped plane and polish. Reverend Phillips looked up from his Bible, surprise and concern warring on his weathered face. "Clara, my dear, we heard you were lost in the avalanche." "I survived," Clara said simply, "with Mr. Tallbear's help." The Reverend's gaze flicked to Joseph, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "I see, and you've come for—" "Sanctuary," Clara said, "and to examine the church records. I need to verify some dates regarding my husband's property." Reverend Phillips hesitated. Clara could read his thoughts. Harboring an Indian would anger important men like Brennan, but turning away a widow seeking help would violate everything he preached. "Of course," he said finally. "Christian charity demands no less." Clara felt her shoulders relax slightly, one ally, however reluctant. It was a beginning. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside the church, Clara opened Thomas's journal and began to plan her counterattack. Marcus Brennan had stolen her house, but he'd underestimated what a patient seamstress could accomplish with the right tools and enough determination. 3 days of howling wind trapped Clara and Joseph in the church, while Silver Creek hunkered down against the worst blizzard in memory. Reverend Phillips retreated to his private quarters, leaving them the sanctuary's main room and politely ignoring the impropriety of an unmarried man and woman sharing space. Clara made herself useful organizing the church's meager supplies and mending the Reverend's threadbare vestments. Joseph carved new handles for broken tools and repaired loose floorboards with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to making things last. They worked in comfortable companionship, speaking little but aware of each other's presence in ways that made Clara's pulse quicken. "Your stitching grows finer each day," Joseph observed as Clara reinforced the seams on his winter shirt. "My grandmother would say your hands hold healing power." Clara's needle paused mid-stitch. "In Silver Creek, they say my hands are only good for servant's work. Too rough for a lady." "Silver Creek people see poorly, then." Joseph's voice carried quiet conviction. "These hands saved my life, built shelter that kept us alive, create beauty from torn cloth. What could be more valuable?" Heat rose in Clara's cheeks. Thomas had appreciated her skills, but he'd never spoken of them with such reverence. "You make it sound noble. It's just what I know how to do." "Knowledge that preserves life is always noble." Outside, wind shrieked around the building's corners. Clara pulled her shawl closer and moved to the window, watching snow pile against the glass in drifts that would soon reach the sill. "We can't stay here much longer. The Reverend is kind, but he's frightened of Brennan." Joseph joined her at the window, close enough that she could smell pine soap and wood smoke on his skin. "Fear makes people do shameful things, but it also makes them grateful for those who show courage. I don't feel particularly courageous." "No?" Joseph's reflection in the glass showed gentle amusement. "You faced an avalanche, built shelter in killing cold, defended injured men against armed enemies. What do you call courage?" Clara thought of her stammering attempts to speak in town meetings, her trembling hands when Morrison threatened her, The way her voice disappeared entirely when Brennan looked at her with cold calculation. Courage should look different, sound different. My grandfather taught that courage comes in many forms. The warrior's courage is loud and bright, like lightning. The mother's courage is quiet and constant, like the earth that feeds growing plants. Joseph's hand touched the window glass beside hers. Your courage is the steady kind. It does not boast, but it does not break. Clara studied their reflections, her pale face framed by dark hair that had long since escaped its pins, his strong profile and thoughtful eyes. They looked like people who belonged together, who fit in ways that had nothing to do with social convention. The thought terrified her. Joseph, she began, then stopped. How could she explain the complexity of her feelings? The way his presence made her feel capable and worthy? How his quiet strength awakened something in her she'd thought buried with Thomas? I know, he said quietly. I feel it too. Clara's breath caught. Feel what? The pull between us, like river current growing stronger each day. Joseph turned from the window to face her directly. In my culture, such feelings are gifts from the spirits. But in your world? In my world, it would destroy us both. Clara's voice was barely a whisper. A white woman and an Indian man. They'd call it unnatural, sinful. You'd be killed and I'd be shunned. Joseph nodded gravely. I know the dangers. I have seen what happens to mixed couples who stay in white settlements. And yet, Clara found herself stepping closer, drawn by warmth that had nothing to do with the inadequate heating. I've never felt so understood by anyone. Even Thomas, bless him, never saw me the way you do. How do I see you? Clara struggled for words. Like I'm worth something, like my quietness isn't a flaw to be fixed, but a strength to be valued. Joseph's hand rose to touch her cheek, calloused fingers gentle against her skin. Because you are worth everything, silent woman. Your heart, your mind, your capable hands, all precious beyond white men's understanding. Clara closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. When had anyone last held her with such reverence? Thomas had been kind but distant, more companion than passionate husband. The men who'd pursued her since his death had seen only property to be acquired, not a woman to be cherished. This is impossible, she whispered. Many good things seem impossible, Joseph replied, until they happen. The blizzard's fury increased through the night, trapping them more completely than any prison. Clara lay on a makeshift bed of pew cushions, listening to Joseph's steady breathing from across the room and fighting the urge to cross the space between them. Propriety demanded distance, but her heart craved connection with someone who truly saw her. Near dawn, she woke to find him feeding the small fire they'd built in a metal basin, his movements careful and practiced. Snow had drifted against the windows in fantastic shapes, turning the church into a crystalline cave. Can't sleep either? She asked softly. Joseph looked up, firelight playing across his features. Too many thoughts about what comes after the storm ends. Clara sat up, pulling her shawl around her shoulders. You mean returning to your people? I mean choosing between safety and truth. Joseph's expression grew troubled. I could take you to Ute territory where mixed marriages are accepted. We could build a life away from Silver Creek's hatred. But Marcus Brennan would keep stealing from others. Your husband's murderers would never face justice. Evil would flourish because good people chose comfort over confrontation. Clara felt her heart clench. And if we stay to fight, we risk everything, our lives, our chance for happiness, our future children's safety. Joseph's voice carried the weight of impossible choices. I cannot ask you to make such sacrifice. Clara was quiet for a long moment, watching flames dance in the metal basin. Then she rose and moved to sit beside him, close enough to share body heat in the cold church. Thomas used to say that some things are worth dying for, she said slowly. Justice, truth, protecting innocent people from those who would harm them. And do you believe that? Clara thought of the families driven from their homes by Brennan's schemes, the Ute families who'd lost fathers to mining accidents, the widows pressured into marriages that were little better than slavery. I believe some things are worth living for, and living requires fighting when necessary. Joseph's hand found hers in the firelight. Even if it means choosing between love and safety? What safety? Clara's voice grew stronger. Morrison made it clear, submit to marriage or face exile. Brennan will never stop stealing what doesn't belong to him. There is no safety in surrender, only delayed destruction. And love? Clara turned to face him fully, her hand tightening around his. Real love grows stronger under pressure, doesn't it? Like steel in the forge? Joseph's eyes searched her face. You would risk everything? Social position, white acceptance, easy paths through life? I never had social position to lose. White acceptance has been denied me since childhood because of my stammer. And easy paths? Clara laughed softly. Joseph, I'm a widow with no family, no property, and no prospects except marriage to a cruel man. What exactly am I risking? Joseph brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Your life, silent woman. If we pursue justice together, Brennan will try to destroy us both. Then we'd better make sure he fails. Joseph's smile was fierce and proud. My grandfather would say you have the heart of a warrior. Your grandfather sounds like a wise man. He also said that the spirits sometimes bring together souls that were meant to find each other across great distances and differences. Joseph's free hand rose to cup her face. Perhaps they brought you to that mountain cabin for more than survival. Clara felt her pulse race as his thumb traced her cheekbone. Perhaps they did. The kiss that followed was gentle and reverent, nothing like the rough demands of the men who'd pursued her for property rather than affection. Joseph kissed her like she was precious, like her response mattered more than his own desires. When they finally broke apart, Clara rested her forehead against his, breathing in the warmth of his presence. Whatever comes next, I'm glad the avalanche brought us together. Even if it destroys us? Even then, Clara's voice carried quiet certainty. Some connections are worth any price. Outside, the blizzard began to ease, wind dying to whispers against the church walls. Soon they would have to face Silver Creek again, to confront Brennan and Morrison and all the hatred that awaited them. But for now, in the firelit sanctuary, Clara allowed herself to believe in possibilities beyond survival. Joseph's arms encircled her, strong and protective, and for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt truly at home. When this is over, she whispered against his shoulder, what kind of life do you think we could build? Joseph's hand smoothed her hair, fingers gentle against the tangles. A life where your voice is heard and valued, where our children learn both English letters and Ute symbols, where justice matters more than profit. Clara closed her eyes, imagining such a future. A house where laughter replaced fearful silence, where her skills were appreciated rather than merely tolerated, where love grew from respect instead of convenience. It sounds like paradise, she murmured. It sounds like what we will fight for, Joseph replied, together. The storm's end would bring new challenges, Clara knew. Brennan would not surrender easily, and Silver Creek's prejudices ran deeper than winter frost. But she was no longer the frightened widow who'd accepted rejection as her due. She was a woman who'd survived an avalanche, built shelter in killing cold, and found love in the most unlikely circumstances. If she could do all that, she could certainly face down one corrupt businessman and his hired thugs. The fire burned low as dawn approached, but Clara felt warmth that had nothing to do with flames. Whatever the future held, she would meet it with Joseph beside her, and that made all the difference. Morning brought crystalline silence and air so clear it seemed to ring like church bells. Clara woke in Joseph's arms, propriety forgotten in the face of genuine affection. They dressed quietly, aware that Reverend Phillips would soon emerge for morning prayers. The snow has stopped, Joseph observed, peering through the frost-etched windows. We can move freely now. Clara nodded, though part of her wished the storm would continue indefinitely. In the church's sanctuary, they'd found a peace that the outside world would never allow. But Thomas's journal pressed against her ribs through her bodice, reminding her of unfinished business. Reverend Phillips, she called, as the elderly minister appeared from his private quarters. I need to examine the church records, specifically the documentation of property transfers and business partnerships from the early days of Silver Creek. The Reverend looked uncomfortable. Clara, my dear, perhaps it would be better to let sleeping dogs lie. Mr. Brennan is a powerful man, and he's not known for his patience with those who challenge his authority. Then it's past time someone did challenge him, Clara replied firmly. Thomas helped build this church, this town. His memory deserves better than theft and corruption. Reverend Phillips glanced nervously at Joseph, clearly uncomfortable with the Indian man's presence, but unable to voice his objections directly. The records are incomplete. Many documents were lost in the fire of 78. But not all, Clara pressed, and those that remain might contain information about the original land grants, the founding partnerships, the early mining claims. After a long hesitation, the Reverend nodded toward a locked cabinet behind the altar. The surviving records are there, but Clara, if you find what I think you're looking for, it will mean war with the most dangerous man in Silver Creek. Then war it is, Clara said quietly. Joseph helped her move the heavy ledgers to a table where morning light provided adequate illumination. The records were indeed incomplete, many pages water-damaged or torn, but Clara's seamstress eye was trained to work with imperfect materials. What she found made her blood run cold. Silver Creek's founding documents revealed a partnership between 5 men who'd pooled resources to establish the settlement. Thomas Whitmore, Samuel Phillips, the Reverend's late brother, Jacob Morrison, Jake Morrison's father, Henry Brennan, Marcus's father, and a 5th man whose name had been carefully scraped from every document. Look at this, Clara whispered, pointing to a faded entry. The original mining claims were divided equally among the partners, but someone has altered the documents to show the Brennan and Morrison families owning larger shares. Joseph studied the careful forgeries. The ink is different colors. These changes were made years after the original documents. Clara turned pages carefully, finding more evidence of systematic fraud. Death certificates that didn't match church burial records. Property transfers dated after the supposed sellers had died. Claims that had been abandoned by families who'd actually been driven away or killed. It's been going on for decades, she breathed. Not just Thomas, not just recent widows. The Brennans and Morrisons have been stealing this town piece by piece since the beginning. And the 5th partner? Joseph asked, noting the scraped-away names. Clara felt her heart race as understanding dawned. Someone who had to be eliminated completely, someone whose very existence threatened their scheme. She ran her finger along the scraped sections, feeling for impressions in the paper. Years of working with delicate fabrics had given her sensitive touch, and gradually she could make out traces of the obliterated letters. Joseph, she whispered, I think the 5th partner was Ute. Joseph's expression grew very still. What makes you think so? Clara pointed to a partially visible signature. See how the letters flow, like someone learned to write English but kept the fluid style of pictographic symbols, and here? She indicated a margin note. Someone wrote Speaks with Stars in English letters, then crossed it out. Speaks with Stars was my grandfather's father, Joseph said quietly. He died when I was very young, but the elders said he was cheated by white partners in some business venture. Clara felt pieces falling into place like perfectly fitted seams. If your great-grandfather was a founding partner, then your family has legal claim to a portion of every mine, every business, every property in Silver Creek. Claims that would threaten everything the Brennans and Morrisons have built. Exactly. Clara's mind raced through implications. That's why there have been so many accidents involving Ute men who worked the mines. They weren't just eliminating competition, they were eliminating anyone who might remember the original partnership. Joseph was quiet for a long moment, studying the doctored documents. My people have oral traditions about Speaks with Stars, stories about how he trusted white partners and lost everything to their greed. Not lost, Clara corrected. Stolen. But theft can be proven, and what's stolen can be returned. Reverend Phillips had been listening from across the room, his face growing increasingly pale. Clara, if you're right about this, then half the property in Silver Creek was obtained through fraud. Including the church land? Clara asked pointedly. The Reverend's silence was answer enough. Clara gathered the evidence carefully, her seamstress training serving her well as she documented each piece of fraud with methodical precision. The original partnership documents, the forged transfers, the altered death certificates, all of it painted a picture of corruption spanning 2 generations. "We need to get this to the territorial authorities," she said. "Someone above Brennan's influence who can act on evidence of systematic fraud." "The nearest territorial judge is in Denver," Reverend Phillips said reluctantly. "A week's journey in good weather." "Then we'd better start traveling," Clara replied. "Joseph, would your people provide escort? Safety in numbers?" Joseph nodded grimly. "My people have been waiting generations for justice. They will not let this opportunity pass." As Clara packed the precious documents in her sewing basket, the leather construction would protect them better than any official case. She felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She was no longer just fighting for her own property, but for justice that had been denied for decades. "Are you certain about this path?" Joseph asked quietly. "Once we leave Silver Creek with these documents, there will be no turning back. Brennan will know we have evidence that could destroy him." Clara looked around the small church where she'd found sanctuary, love, and purpose. When she spoke, her voice carried no trace of the stammer that had plagued her for so long. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Outside, Silver Creek was waking to a world transformed by snow and storm. Soon, it would be transformed again by the truth 2 unlikely allies had uncovered in the quiet sanctuary of a frontier church. The war for justice was about to begin. Clara and Joseph left Silver Creek before dawn, traveling with a small band of Ute warriors who'd arrived in the night like shadows given form. Singing Crane had sent her best riders after Joseph's message reached the winter camp. Men who could move swiftly and silently through terrain that would challenge experienced mountain men. The precious documents rode secure in Clara's sewing basket, wrapped in oiled cloth and protected by layers of carefully arranged thread and fabric. If anyone searched the basket, they would find only a seamstress's working supplies. The evidence that could topple Silver Creek's power structure lay hidden beneath innocent embroidery hoops and spare buttons. 2 days hard riding to Denver," said Stonewolf, the war party's leader and Joseph's cousin. "But Brennan's men already pursue. They left town hours ago." Clara felt her stomach clench. "How do you know?" "Ute scouts watch all trails from Silver Creek. 6 riders, heavily armed, led by the pale-eyed one who threatened you." "Morrison." Clara wasn't surprised he'd been sent to stop them, but 6 armed men against their small party seemed overwhelming odds. "Can we outrun them?" Stonewolf's smile was sharp as winter wind. "White men ride like they hunt, loud and direct. We know paths they cannot follow." The day's travel proved him right. While Brennan's men thundered along the main trail, the Ute party took mountain paths that wound through forest and around frozen streams. Clara's new moccasins gripped ice-slick rocks where her old boots would have failed. The horse Stonewolf had provided was sure-footed and steady, bred for mountain terrain rather than speed. But pursuit was relentless. By evening, when they made cold camp in a protected grove, Stonewolf reported that Morrison's party had gained ground by traveling through the night. "They push their horses too hard," Joseph observed. "Desperation makes them careless." "Desperation makes them dangerous," Clara corrected. "Morrison knows what happens if we reach Denver with this evidence. Brennan will destroy him along with everyone else." She was right. During the night, Morrison's men tried to circle around and cut off their escape route. Only alert Ute sentries prevented disaster, waking the camp in time to slip away through darkness that concealed their movements. Dawn found them higher in the mountains, following game trails so narrow that horses had to move single file. Clara's hands were numb despite her thick gloves, and ice formed in her breath as they climbed toward a pass Stonewolf claimed would put them ahead of their pursuers. "There," Stonewolf pointed to smoke rising from the main trail below. "They make fire to warm themselves. Soft white men cannot endure cold as we do." Clara studied the distant camp through morning haze. 6 figures huddled around flames that would be visible for miles. Morrison was either confident of catching them or too cold to care about concealment. They're not just following, she realized. They're herding us toward something. Joseph's expression grew troubled. What do you mean? Clara pointed to the terrain ahead, a narrow valley with steep sides and limited exits. Morrison knows this country. He's driven us into a trap. Stonewolf studied the landscape with experienced eyes. The woman speaks truth. If we enter that valley, they can block both ends and wait for us to freeze or starve. Then we don't enter the valley, Clara said. We go around. Around means 3 extra days through country that will kill horses and men alike, Stonewolf warned, and winter storms come. Clara felt the familiar tightness in her chest that had always preceded her worst stammering episodes. 6 armed men behind them, impassable terrain ahead, and evidence that could save countless lives riding in her sewing basket. The weight of responsibility threatened to crush her voice entirely. Then Joseph's hand found hers, warm and steady despite the bitter cold. "What would your husband do?" he asked quietly. Clara thought of Thomas, careful and methodical, never taking unnecessary risks but never backing down from necessary ones. He'd find another way. Thomas always said there were more solutions to any problem than most people could see. She pulled his journal from her reticule, studying his detailed maps of the territory. Thomas had marked not just the main trails, but seasonal paths, hunting routes, places where desperate travelers might find shelter or passage. "Here," she said, pointing to a series of marks near their current position. Thomas noted a mining trail that connects to an old Ute trading route. It's steep and dangerous, but it bypasses the valley entirely. Stonewolf examined the journal entries. "Your husband knew country well. This path exists, but it has not been used for many seasons. Rockfalls may have blocked it." "Better than certain ambush," Joseph said grimly. They changed course immediately, leaving the established trail for a route that challenged both horses and riders. Clara's mare stumbled on loose shale, recovered, pressed on with the determination of an animal that understood survival depended on forward movement. By midday, they could no longer see Morrison's smoke. But they could hear something worse, the distant crack of rifle fire echoing off mountain walls. "They've found our trail," Stonewolf said, "and they're close enough to shoot." Clara felt her pulse race. "How close?" "Close enough that we cannot stop to rest or warm ourselves. We reach the trading route before dark, or we do not reach it at all." The afternoon became a nightmare of ice, wind, and the constant fear of bullets finding their mark. Clara's world narrowed to the rhythm of her horse's breathing, the creak of leather, the burn of cold air in her lungs. Behind them, rifle shots came closer with each passing hour. Then, just as the sun touched the western peaks, Stonewolf raised his hand for silence. Ahead, the trail split around a massive boulder formation. To the left, the path they'd been following continued downward towards certain ambush. To the right, barely visible, ancient handholds had been carved into rock, the beginning of the Ute trading route. "Horses cannot climb there," Stonewolf said. "We continue on foot or we make our stand here." Clara looked at the precarious route carved into living rock, then back at the trail where rifle fire grew steadily closer. Her sewing basket felt impossibly heavy, not from its physical weight, but from the lives that depended on the evidence it contained. "We climb," she said. They abandoned the horses, taking only what they could carry on their backs. Clara's basket went into a pack Joseph shouldered while she carried water and food supplies. The ancient handholds were slippery with ice, barely wide enough for modern boots, carved for people smaller and more agile than frontier settlers. But they climbed. Clara's world became the next handhold, the next foothold, the next breath drawn in air so thin it burned her lungs. Below, Morrison's men reached the abandoned horses and realized their quarry had literally gone to ground. Their shouts of frustration echoed off stone walls, but they couldn't follow where horses couldn't go. Night fell as they reached a sheltered ledge where ancient travelers had built windbreaks from fitted stones. Clara collapsed against the rock wall, exhausted beyond anything she'd ever experienced. Her hands were bloody from gripping ice-covered stone. Her legs shook with fatigue, but they were alive and ahead of their pursuers. "Tomorrow we reach the trading route proper. Stonewolf said, sharing dried meat that tasted better than any feast. From there, 2 days to Denver on paths white men do not know. Clara nodded, too tired for words. But as she settled into her blankets, she felt Joseph's warmth beside her and knew they would make it. They had to make it. Too many people were counting on the truth hidden in her sewing basket. Below them, campfires marked where Morrison's men had stopped for the night. But above them, stars wheeled in patterns that had guided Ute travelers for countless generations. Clara fell asleep watching those ancient lights, trusting in wisdom older than Silver Creek's corruption. They would reach Denver. They would find justice. And Marcus Brennan's reign of theft and murder would finally end. Denver rose from the plains like a promise of civilization, its brick buildings and paved streets a sharp contrast to Silver Creek's rough frontier architecture. Clara felt overwhelmed by the bustle of carriages, the crowds of well-dressed citizens, the sheer scale of territorial government offices that could determine the fate of everyone she cared about. "Judge Harrison holds court in the federal building," said the clerk who'd examined their documents with growing amazement. "But ma'am, accusations this serious. You'll need more than old papers and Indian testimony to convince a territorial judge." Clara felt her familiar stammer threaten to return. In Silver Creek, among people who knew her, she'd found her voice. Here, surrounded by strangers who saw only a frontier woman in trail-worn clothes, the old uncertainties crept back. "The evidence speaks for itself," Joseph said quietly. "Forged documents, altered records, systematic fraud spanning 2 generations." The clerk's expression grew skeptical as he looked at Joseph's Indian features, his mix of traditional and white clothing. "Sir, I'm sure you mean well, but federal courts require testimony from reliable witnesses." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. She understood the clerk's meaning perfectly. Indian testimony was considered inherently unreliable by white courts, regardless of its truth or importance. "Then they'll have mine," she said, her voice carrying new authority. "I'm Thomas Whitmore's widow, a founding family member of Silver Creek. My testimony should carry sufficient weight." "Perhaps, ma'am, but Judge Harrison is particular about evidence. You'll need documentation that can withstand legal challenge." Clara opened her sewing basket and began removing items with deliberate precision. The original partnership documents carefully preserved, the forged property transfers with their telltale ink variations, the altered death certificates that didn't match church records. Each piece of evidence laid out like a seamstress, arranging pattern pieces. The clerk's skepticism faded as he examined the documents. "Ma'am, if these are authentic—" "They are," Clara said firmly. "And there are witnesses who can corroborate the fraud. Families driven from their homes, workers who died in suspicious accidents, tribal members who remember the original partnerships." "The problem," said a new voice, "is getting those witnesses to Denver alive." Clara turned to see a tall man in an expensive suit, studying their evidence from the doorway. His silver hair and judicial bearing suggested authority, but his expression was troubled. "Judge Harrison," the clerk said nervously, "these people claim to have evidence of systematic fraud in Silver Creek." "I can see that." The judge examined the documents with practiced eyes. "Mrs. Whitmore, isn't it? Your reputation precedes you. Marcus Brennan sent word that you might attempt to file fraudulent claims against his legitimate business interests." Clara felt the familiar cold fear in her stomach. Even here, Brennan's influence reached ahead to poison the well of justice. "He's lying, Your Honor. The evidence that could easily have been forged by someone with access to old documents and considerable skill." Judge Harrison's tone was not unkind, but it was skeptical. "Mr. Brennan has provided character references from prominent Silver Creek citizens. You, on the other hand, arrive with an Indian companion and accusations that would overturn 2 decades of legal property transfers." Clara realized that they were losing before they'd even begun. Brennan's money and influence had reached Denver first, shaping the narrative before they could present their case. The judge wanted to be fair, but he was also practical. Territorial courts depended on the support of established business leaders. "Your Honor," Joseph said quietly, "may I speak?" Judge Harrison's expression grew more skeptical. "Son, I'm afraid Indian testimony isn't admissible in federal court. Nothing personal, but territorial law is clear on this matter." I understand, Joseph replied. But I'm not here as Indian witness. I'm here as heir to Speaks with Stars, original partner in the Silver Creek Mining Consortium. The judge's eyebrows rose. That's an interesting claim. Do you have documentation of this inheritance? Joseph reached into his jacket and withdrew a small leather pouch Clara had never seen before. From it, he removed a document written on bark paper in both English and pictographic symbols. Partnership agreement between Speaks with Stars and 4 white partners, Joseph said. Witnessed by tribal elders and recorded in both languages to prevent misunderstanding. Judge Harrison examined the bark document with fascination. This is remarkable. The English portion matches the surviving fragments in your other evidence, Mrs. Whitmore. But how do we verify its authenticity? The symbols tell the same story as the English words, Joseph explained. And tribal oral history has preserved every detail of the original agreement. My people have been waiting 3 generations for white courts to acknowledge what was stolen from Speaks with Stars. Clara watched understanding dawn on the judge's face. If Joseph's claim was legitimate, then every property transfer in Silver Creek for the past 30 years could be challenged. The legal implications were staggering. Mr. Brennan failed to mention this aspect of the case, Judge Harrison said dryly. I suspect he doesn't know about your heritage, young man. He knows, Joseph replied grimly. Why do you think there have been so many accidents involving Ute men who worked the mines? The judge was quiet for a long moment, studying the evidence spread across his clerk's desk. This case is far more complex than I was led to believe. Mrs. Whitmore, are you prepared to testify under oath about the circumstances of your husband's death? Yes, Your Honor. And you, Mr. Tallbear, can you produce tribal witnesses who will corroborate your oral history claims? 3 elders who knew Speaks with Stars personally are riding to Denver as we speak, Joseph said. They should arrive within 2 days. Judge Harrison nodded slowly. Then we'll convene a formal hearing, but I must warn you both. If these allegations prove false, you'll face charges of fraud and perjury. Mr. Brennan has significant resources and political connections. This won't be an easy fight. Nothing worthwhile ever is, Clara replied. The next 3 days transformed Clara's understanding of legal warfare. Brennan arrived in Denver with 2 lawyers, a collection of character witnesses, and documentation that painted Clara as a mentally unstable widow influenced by savage companions. His case was smooth, professional, and utterly convincing to anyone who didn't examine the evidence closely. But Judge Harrison was thorough. He brought in handwriting experts who confirmed the forgeries Clara had identified. He interviewed the character witnesses separately and found significant inconsistencies in their testimony. Most importantly, he listened respectfully when the Ute elders arrived and shared oral histories that corroborated every detail of Joseph's inheritance claim. The hearing stretched across 5 days with testimony that revealed the full scope of Brennan's criminal enterprise. Clara found her voice growing stronger with each session, her stammer disappearing entirely as she recounted Thomas's careful documentation of mining claims and suspicious deaths. Mrs. Whitmore, Brennan's lead attorney said during cross-examination, isn't it true that your marriage to Thomas Whitmore was troubled? That you sought comfort in inappropriate relationships after his death? Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. My marriage was happy and respectful. My relationship with Mr. Tallbear began as mutual aid during a survival crisis and has developed into partnership based on shared values and mutual respect. Partnership? The attorney's tone was mocking. Is that what you call liaisons between white women and Indian men? Judge Harrison's gavel cracked like a rifle shot. Counselor, you will confine your questions to matters relevant to property law and fraud allegations. Mrs. Whitmore's personal relationships are not on trial here. But the damage was done. Clara could see disapproval in the faces of court observers. Scandal sheets would spread gossip about the Indian-loving widow, and her reputation would be destroyed regardless of the trial's outcome. Joseph leaned forward to whisper in her ear, Truth is truth, regardless of what small minds think. Clara nodded, drawing strength from his quiet confidence. Let them gossip. Let them disapprove. She was fighting for justice, not social acceptance. On the final day, Judge Harrison delivered his verdict with the weight of territorial authority behind every word. After careful review of evidence and testimony, this court finds credible proof of systematic fraud in Silver Creek property transfers dating back to the settlement's founding. The original partnership agreement between 5 men, including the Ute leader known as Speaks with Stars, was legitimate and binding under territorial law. Clara felt her heart race as the judge continued. Marcus Brennan and Jacob Morrison are hereby ordered to surrender all properties obtained through fraudulent documentation. Compensation will be paid to families illegally dispossessed of their holdings. Most significantly, the heir of Speaks with Stars, Mr. Joseph Tallbear, is recognized as legitimate claimant to 1/5 of all Silver Creek properties established under the original partnership. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Brennan's face went white as paper, his attorneys immediately beginning discussions of appeals. But Clara barely heard the commotion. They had won. Justice would finally be served. Furthermore, Judge Harrison's voice cut through the noise, this court orders the territorial marshal to investigate allegations of murder and intimidation in Silver Creek. Criminal charges will be filed where evidence warrants. Clara felt tears of relief streaming down her face. Thomas's murder would be investigated. The families driven from their homes would receive compensation. The systematic corruption that had poisoned Silver Creek for decades would finally end. As they left the courthouse, Joseph took her hand in full view of the crowd that had gathered to witness the dramatic verdict. "What happens now?" Clara asked. Joseph's smile was fierce with satisfaction. "Now we go home, silent woman. We go home to build the life we've earned." Clara squeezed his fingers, no longer caring who saw their affection or disapproved of their partnership. They had fought for justice and won. Everything else was just gossip. 6 months later, spring came early to Silver Creek, melting snow from the mountainsides and filling streams with crystal runoff that sparkled in morning sunlight. Clara stood on the porch of the house she and Joseph had built together, not Thomas's old cabin, which held too many painful memories, but a new structure that blended frontier practicality with Ute architectural wisdom. The trial's aftermath had transformed the settlement. Marcus Brennan fled Denver before the territorial marshal could arrest him, taking what portable wealth he could carry and leaving behind a town struggling to rebuild its identity. Jake Morrison now worked his family's reduced holdings honestly, his swagger replaced by sullen acceptance of legal judgment. More importantly, families had returned. The Hendersons, driven out 3 years ago by forged debt papers, reclaimed their farm and bakery. The Kowalski family resumed operation of the general store that had been sold to cover fabricated gambling losses. Even some Ute families had established seasonal camps near town, trading fairly with settlers who no longer feared legal retaliation. "The new school is taking shape nicely," Joseph observed, joining Clara on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. Clara followed his gaze to the building site where volunteer labor was raising walls that would shelter children of all backgrounds. As joint proprietors of Silver Creek's largest properties, she and Joseph had donated land and lumber for the project. More importantly, they'd insisted the school welcome both white and Ute children. "Mrs. Henderson asked if I'd teach sewing classes," Clara said, accepting the warm cup gratefully. "She thinks the older girls should learn practical skills alongside their letters and numbers." "And will you?" Clara smiled. "I think I will. It would be good to pass on what I know to the next generation." Her sewing business had grown beyond anything she'd imagined possible. Freed from Marcus Brennan's economic stranglehold, Silver Creek had begun attracting new families and businesses. Clara's reputation for fine work had spread to Denver and beyond, bringing orders for custom clothing that kept her busy and prosperous. More importantly, her speech difficulties had virtually disappeared. Joseph's patient acceptance had given her confidence to find her voice, and regular interaction with customers and students had strengthened her communication skills beyond her old limitations. "Speaking of the next generation," Joseph said carefully, "Singing Crane visited yesterday while you were in town." Clara felt her pulse quicken. Joseph's grandmother had been observing their marriage with the keen attention of a tribal elder responsible for family harmony. "What did she say?" "She said our house feels ready for children's laughter," Joseph replied with a gentle smile. She also said you've been looking tired in the mornings and eating differently than usual. Clara's hand moved instinctively to her still flat belly. She'd suspected for several weeks but hadn't been certain enough to voice her hopes. I was planning to tell you tonight. Joseph's expression lit with joy. You're certain? As certain as I can be without visiting the doctor in Denver. Clara leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid warmth of his chest against her cheek. Are you pleased? Pleased? Joseph laughed, the sound rich with happiness. Silent woman, I'm honored beyond words. Our child will grow up in a world where justice matters, where different peoples can live together in respect, where love is stronger than hatred. Clara closed her eyes, imagining their future child playing in the garden they'd planted, learning both English letters and Utah symbols, growing up free from the prejudices that had shaped their parents' lives. It wouldn't be easy, mixed families still face suspicion and hostility, but it would be possible in ways it never had been before. I've been thinking about names, she said quietly. And Thomas, if it's a boy, after my first husband who started the fight for justice, even if he didn't live to see it won. Joseph nodded approvingly. Thomas Tallbear, a strong name that honors both traditions. And if it's a girl? Clara smiled. Hope, because that's what she'll represent. Hope for a better future than either of us thought possible. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher over their transformed valley. In the distance, Clara could see Ute horses grazing alongside settlers' cattle, children of different backgrounds playing together near the stream, smoke rising from chimneys that sheltered families living without fear of illegal eviction. Do you ever regret it? Joseph asked quietly. The scandal, the gossip, the difficulties we faced? Clara considered the question seriously. Their marriage had indeed caused scandal. Newspaper articles about the Indian-loving widow and the savage who stole white man's inheritance had followed them for months. Some Denver society families refused to acknowledge Clara's existence, and certain Silver Creek residents still whispered disapproval when they thought no one was listening. But against that, she weighed the warmth of genuine love, the satisfaction of meaningful work, the knowledge that their fight had created lasting change for countless families. She thought of children who would grow up in a fairer world, widows who would never again face the threats she'd endured, native families who could trade and live without fear of accidents. Never, she said firmly, not for a single moment. Joseph's hand found hers, calloused fingers intertwining with gentle strength. Even when society matrons in Denver refuse to acknowledge your existence? Clara laughed. Especially then. Joseph, I spent my whole life trying to earn approval from people who would never see my worth. Now I'm married to a man who values my thoughts, my skills, my voice. I have work that matters, friends who respect me, and a child coming who will never know the shame I carried for so long. No shame, Joseph agreed. Our child will speak with confidence, knowing both parents fought for justice and won. Clara leaned back against his shoulder, feeling their baby's presence like a secret warmth beneath her heart. Around them, Silver Creek hummed with honest activity, hammers ringing from construction sites, children's laughter from the schoolyard, the steady rhythm of a community rebuilding itself on foundations of truth rather than theft. Tell me again about the future you see, she said softly. Joseph's voice carried the cadence of traditional storytelling. I see a town where Utah traders bring goods to market without fear, where white settlers learn traditional farming methods that work with the land instead of against it. I see our daughter or son teaching their own children to read both English books and star patterns, to value both individual achievement and community responsibility. I see a school where children learn that different doesn't mean dangerous, Clara added. Where my sewing classes teach both practical skills and patience, where your woodworking shows them that strong things are built with care and time. Joseph's hand moved to rest gently over hers on her belly. I see grandchildren who will never know a world where love is limited by the color of skin or the sound of names. Clara felt tears of joy prick her eyes. 6 months ago, she'd been a stammering widow facing forced marriage or exile. Now she was a confident woman carrying the child of a man who saw her true worth, living in a community they'd helped transform through courage and determination. The baby is lucky, she whispered. To be born into this world we've built. No, Joseph corrected gently. We are lucky. Lucky that an avalanche brought us together. Lucky that we found courage to fight for truth. Lucky that love proved stronger than hatred. Clara nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. Their story had begun with destruction, an avalanche that buried her old life completely. But from that destruction had come something better. Partnership based on respect, love that had survived legal battles and social disapproval, and now new life that would carry their values into the future. As the sun reached its zenith, painting Silver Creek in shades of gold and promise, Clara felt the deep satisfaction of a seamstress who had taken torn fabric and created something beautiful, useful, and lasting. Their life together was like her finest work, crafted with patience, strengthened through testing, and designed to endure whatever challenges the future might bring. In her arms, Joseph's breathing settled into the rhythm of contentment. Around them, their transformed community continued its work of building a more just world. And within her, their child grew strong on the foundation of parents who had learned that the most important battles were worth any price, and that love, real, honest, courageous love, could indeed move mountains. The avalanche that had nearly killed them had instead become the beginning of everything that mattered. Clara closed her eyes and smiled, finally understanding that sometimes destruction was just another word for the space cleared for something better to grow. Epilogue, 20 years later. From the Journal of Hope, Tall Bear. Whitmore, age 19, written on the occasion of her acceptance to Denver College for Women. People often ask about my unusual name and family history. Why is a girl with clearly mixed heritage called Hope Whitmore? Why does she speak fluent Ute and English with equal ease? Why does she know both embroidery stitches and traditional beadwork patterns? The answer lies in the story my parents tell about an avalanche that changed everything, not just for them, but for our entire community. Mother always says that the mountain gave them to each other, along with the courage to fight for what was right. Father adds that the spirits sometimes work through natural disasters to bring together souls that were meant to find each other. I know their story has become something of a legend in Silver Creek. The stammering widow and the injured Ute guide who survived impossible odds discovered decades of corruption and transformed a town through determination and love. Children in our school learn about the legal battle that established indigenous property rights alongside territorial law. Families throughout the territory know that justice is possible when people are willing to fight for it. But for me, it's simpler than legend or legal precedent. It's the story of two people who saw past what society told them was possible, who built a life based on respect and partnership, who raised me to believe that different perspectives make us stronger rather than weaker. Mother taught me that patient, careful work creates lasting beauty. Father showed me that wisdom comes from listening to the land and honoring the knowledge of those who came before. Together, they demonstrated that love is not limited by the boundaries others try to impose, and that courage is often quiet but always persistent. As I prepare to leave Silver Creek for college, I carry their lessons with me. In my trunk are examples of my finest needlework alongside traditional Ute crafts I learned from great-grandmother Singing Crane. In my mind are stories told in two languages, songs that bridge cultures, and the absolute certainty that I am worthy of any future I'm brave enough to pursue. My name is Hope because I represent what my parents dared to believe was possible. In a world that told them their love was impossible, their partnership unnatural, their fight hopeless, they chose to build something beautiful anyway. And every day in our thriving community where children learn from teachers of many backgrounds, where businesses serve customers regardless of heritage, where justice matters more than profit, I see proof that hope, patient, persistent, courageously defended, can indeed move mountains. The avalanche that nearly destroyed my parents instead became the foundation for everything I am, everything our family has built, and everything I will carry forward into the future. That is the power of love that refuses to be limited by fear.